we need to make a shift. So I'd like to invite my friends, Todd Greene, Ann Price, and Robert Espinoza to join me on stage to continue this conversation. So welcome. I brought these folks on stage because they are some of the most inspirational leaders to me right now in the workforce development field, so I wanted to share them with all of you. And I'm going to start just by asking you all to introduce yourself and say a little bit about your organization or your day job or anything else you want folks to know.
Well, good morning, and can I just say thank you to you and your organization and to the team for putting this together. This has been amazing. What a great time to start with Otis Redding and Tina Turner. I mean, like really, so thank you for that. My name is Todd Greene, and I am the executive director of an organization called WorkRise. And what we do is we support research around issues related to the labor market, specifically challenges that people working for lower wages face. And we bring that evidence to bear with policymakers, with other individuals, employers, labor advocates, worker advocates, and others who can do something with it. So it's great to be here.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Ann Price. I'm the co-founder and co-president of the Maven Collaborative. We center race, gender, and joy in the pursuit of economic justice. We just launched our org 18 months ago, so we're babies. But we're very, very proud to be able to speak our truths and really support bold solutions.
Hi everybody, I'm Robert Espinoza. I'm the CEO of National Skills Coalition, and we're a national organization that focuses on state and federal policies that equip workers with the skills, the resources, and the supports to succeed in a wide range of jobs, specifically jobs that don't require a college degree, but usually require some level of high school education. And we are bipartisan, we work closely with businesses, and we work with amazing partner organizations like the National Fund. Thank you.
Now you got to hand the mic over. So I'm going to start with you, Todd. Can you tell me a little bit about your journey to this moment and the moments that have informed you as you've thought about this work, about advancing workforce equity?
Sure. First of all, thank you for sharing your story, and I think many of us have stories that may not be exactly the same, but still echo many of those challenges and opportunities. And I'll just share that mine really represents a bit of that. I know there's a lot in the news about immigrants lately, and it's been very concerning, but that really is my story about how I even thought about work. My grandparents were immigrants from the Bahamas, and so as part of that experience, they really lived what my understanding was the American dream, and they were people who did what we used to call back then a day's work. So many people may not be familiar with that term, but really they were domestics, and that's what they did in order to try to improve their lives and provide for their children. And so growing up in a place like that really informed my thought about work and really dignity, to hear a lot of the stories that were shared with them about how they were treated by their employers in the context, how they were talked to, etc. So I think that's been an important moment, but I'll pivot for a moment into the moments that inform me, and I'm going to get to one, but one important moment is, or a set of moments, is having opportunities to come here and to see people. I just had a conversation with Chris, or to talk to John Helton about the things that are going on. I can remember these conferences. I see Ashley. We have these opportunities to really learn and build from one another, and that's been really important. But being here in Memphis really means something, and Amanda, you talked a bit about this, and I'll just say that 1968, that was a great year for many reasons, but a lot of bad things happened in that year. But that was a year that the civil rights movement really coalesced in a way to absorb worker rights and to really think about dignity. And Dr. King was here working with the sanitation workers, and a lot of that was really about how they could advocate for themselves to create better opportunities, but it was really about dignity. And so to a certain extent, it's like Groundhog Day. We're still talking about dignity. One piece of research that WorkWise just issued over the last couple of weeks had to do with workers who work outside. And 1 in 7 workers who work outside suffer from some serious heat-related concern. So here it is, we're still kind of dealing with these issues that are long-standing. Nonetheless, I really remain hopeful. I appreciate having these types of experiences, and I know that when I think about evidence and how it can be used to share these ideas that we all learn from one another, I feel very encouraged about the future, and that's despite the political headwinds that we face.
So how many people in the audience were in Minneapolis with us? Can I see a whole, okay, yay! So many of you may remember that we had Ann Price on stage talking about occupational segregation. And I would say at the time, occupational segregation might have been a pretty new term that we were using in workforce development. But since then, I've heard people talk about occupational segregation often. One of the things Ann talked about was, at that time, was that occupational segregation really was based on some poor ideas about deservedness or narratives. And I'm curious, Ann, to hear how you think the conversation about occupational segregation has changed. Do you think people in the workforce development field are understanding it, they're working on it? What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, thank you for that. So just a little caveat. So I would say that the work that we do at Maven is a little bit workforce adjacent, right? We're more in the economic justice space. I have a history of working in workforce. And the reason we wanted to focus on occupational segregation is because we thought, and we still think, we need a new metric. We need a new metric to understand systemic and structural racial inequities. And this measure, occupational segregation, is that measure that tells us how deeply embedded racial inequities are in our labor market. It tells us a lot about how we're structured, and from that we can really think about our history. We just heard a lot about the history of work in this country. And when you think about how our labor market has been structured since slavery, so much about it is not different. And so I think for all of us, whether we're in workforce or in the economic justice space, have to, one, understand that history, because it helps you understand what kind of progress we're really making. When we see jobs that are still structured, the conditions still look like post-slavery, then we have to ask ourselves, what is the progress that we're making? So I just wanted to give that caveat. So since that time, I do feel like a lot of people are working on occupational segregation. Certainly it's work that Urban has done, and a lot of others have done, to really think about your regional labor market. I do see it being used more. I do see a little bit more research on it. And that's great, because I think what we're trying to do is say, you know, look, there's metrics we all have to collect. We're mandated to collect some of these metrics, but let's just face it, they're not enough. They're not good enough. They don't tell us enough. And if we don't move outside of that, and I know that we have funding that it doesn't make it easy to do that, but if we don't do that, then how are we going to really find the right solutions? And so that's why it's so important. So the term occupational segregation is so wonky. And we thought about, like, let's go get this branded. Let's go to a brand agency and like see if we can make this, you know, more accessible. And what we found is, brand agency says, we can't do anything with this. Like, I don't know what to do with this. Like, we don't know what to do with it, right? And I kind of get it. It's kind of complex. So what do? We turn to like social media influencers, and we started to work with them and say, can you talk about this, right? Which has been in itself a very interesting experience, very new for us. But it also helps us see how like even ordinary people would pick this up and think about this issue. So the one thing is, as you said, Amanda, we can't move away from these narratives. Like occupational segregation are tied to our deepest, most dominant American narratives, right? About deservedness, about laziness, right? About personal responsibility, about bootstraps. And we have to come to understand in this field that that's so deeply embedded, and if we don't start to unearth that and try to chip away at it, we're perpetuating the same systems that have held so many people down for so long. Now, I know that seems like, well, how do you even do that? Amanda asked me, well, give me an example of what people are doing. So I would say this, it's very interesting, because I've been in the guaranteed income space, and I know it's controversial. Some people are like, well, it discourages work, which is ridiculous. But what it can teach us narrative-wise is about who is deserving. These pilots were really meant to say, families should have the right to make decisions for themselves. Can we trust people? Who do we trust to make decisions for themselves? Can we set up programs so that people are not punished in the way and really constrained from choices? So it's actually a very good example for people working in a variety of fields, because you're talking about deservedness, you're talking about personal responsibility, which is, if you don't make good choices, then you're going to live in a life of poverty. It's your fault. It's the decisions you make, right? And the issue of hard work, because hard work is so tied to our sense of being an American. And so it can teach us a lot about how do we kind of plug away at that, because that's what's keeping us in place. Now, I'll say this last thing, and I'm going to stop talking. You know, I came out of kind of the poverty, social safety net kind of programs in my early career. And talk about a personal journey. When I started, I was doing the same things now that I'm just like, when I hear it, I cringe, right? I didn't know any better. I talked about the underclass, I talked about people making decisions, I talked about all those things. Because that's what I knew. That's how I was trained. When I walk into a Department of Social Services, that is the narrative you're going to hear over and over again. Something's wrong with these people. They're not like us, right? And so I think to move in a field, especially on equity, we have to say maybe what we've learned was not right. Maybe what we've been really putting forward all these years is actually causing harm. And be willing to be disruptive, to willing to be uncomfortable in that, so that we can actually move towards greater solutions. I want to say one last thing, and I'm stopped for real. For real, I'm sorry, I just have to say this, and I just have to say this last thing. When I think about the issue of job quality, for example, and I've been doing some qualitative work, and you hear people talk about, yes, they have a job that has a certain wage, and that checks off one of our boxes. They're in this almost even middle management position, or they moved up to supervisor, check a box. That meets our metric. But then when you hear their stories about those conditions, and the fact that they are so harmed and so stressed that their health is compromised, I have to say, was that a good job? We have to go further. We just have to push ourselves further. And I think that's our role as professionals in this space. I'm done. All right.
I'm going to ask Robert a question, so can we make sure people can hear Robert's answer? So, Robert, you have been doing direct care work for a lot of your professional career. And workforce development has this very complicated relationship with direct care work, whether it be home health aides or child care workers, or a little of our perspective has historically been like, okay, those are entry-level jobs. And it's great if we get people in those jobs as long as we train them up. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what our relationship with direct care jobs should be in the workforce development field.
Yes, absolutely. It's working. So thank you for that, and thank you, Anne, for your comments. I want to build on them in my answer. So for those of you who don't know, I spent about 10 years leading a think tank for PHI, which focused on improving jobs for healthcare workers and nursing assistants to support millions of older adults and people with disabilities. And so the work that we did straddled a range of major issues in populations that we dealt with. What's interesting, and I want to build on Anne's comments, is that the most common question I would get in those 10 years from people who were convinced that this was a workforce that was beleaguered, that needed policy support, industry attention, et cetera, was how did we arrive at this point? Like, why are these jobs poverty level jobs? Why are workers leaving within 90 days, 100% turnover rate in the last year, right? And they're leaving for jobs in fast food and retail, et cetera, right? And history is part of the answer, right? And occupational segregation is part of the answer. The 2 points here that I'll share and then talk about workforce development's responsibility. One is the idea that there is a historical record in the early 1900s as the New Deal was being discussed and agreed upon to exclude home care workers and agricultural workers from basic wage and overtime protections. The bloc of senators who advanced that were largely in the South and were in historical record trying to preserve the Jim Crow era and the work of predominantly black women in supporting their homes, but there were also senators from the Southwest and the West who also wanted to preserve the order that immigrant women from Mexico and Latin America and Asia were supporting, right? And there are numerous quotes from the floor of Congress where they talk about black labor and women of color labor as simply not real work. It's work that women are naturally predisposed to, so why pay them? It's work that they've done for years. Is it that hard, right? And they excluded home care workers and nursing assistants until 2010 from wage and overtime protections, right? And that sent a message in the ways in which the long-term care system was designed and resourced all around the country, that it barely offered enough money for people to offer long-term care and other services to people who needed it, and much less money to create quality jobs for direct care workers, right? And direct care workers are primarily women, 80% are women, more than 60% are people of color, 1 in 4 is an immigrant, and 1 in 4 is aged 55 and older. So it's an older economy supporting an older population, right? And that's an example of occupational segregation. It falls in that list of categories where people of color have often been relegated to jobs that are low in compensation, easily exploitable, and often shuffled around in terms of protections, right? What we saw at PHI is that the majority of advocates in this sector came from the aging and disability sectors, and they also came from healthcare because the primary payer for direct care is Medicaid. And yet Medicaid over the last few decades has also been racialized. It has been presumed as a benefit that people of color are exploiting, and so it's been defunded, especially in certain states. And today, for example, the states that do worst on direct care job quality are states that have not expanded Medicaid and have refused to fund that system, right? And there are many other examples of the ways in which racist policy decisions defunded Medicaid, ultimately hurting direct care jobs, right? Workforce development has an important and critical part in the solution. One is my experience in the 10 years that I was at PHI is that workforce development leaders, including funders, including national organizations and leaders, would often shut the door on us when we asked about the responsibility to support direct care jobs. What about skills training? What about credentials? What about career pathways for these workers? Better data collection. These are all issues that National Skills Coalition works on. And they would say, we're all North Star. Our North Star is quality jobs, and until those jobs pay enough, there's no room for it, right? And I'm saying it in a way that's a little bit crass and direct, but that was the essential message. And so we didn't see that really strong workforce development field advocating for important training, credentials, career pathways, and data collection for direct care workers, even though that same field was saying all workers need care support, right? And if you don't have workers, you can't get care support, right? And so I think this is an opportunity, I think, for us as a sector, and National Skills Coalition is exploring an initiative that will help us do that work, thanks to funding from the Truist Foundation, to understand how do we move the workforce development field writ large to care about care workers, direct care and child care workers, so that they too can have quality training, quality jobs more broadly, and that we can preserve this North Star of quality jobs, right? It's unfair that they're excluded in that way for a variety of reasons, but that's the premise. Yeah.
So I sit on the advisory board for WorkRise with Todd, and that organization does a lot of work around researching for best practices in workforce development. And I spend all of my time, Todd is so sick of hearing me say this, how do we get this to the front line? How do we get this to the front line? How do we get this to the front line? How do we make sure workforce development practitioners have access to these tools? So I'm going to ask you that exact same question on the stage, Todd.
Yeah, that's just a question that we think of every day. Of course, at WorkRise, and I know that the work that you do is very much informed by evidence, research. How do we make sure that you are making the right decisions, particularly when you have limited resources in order to do that? But I'll tell you that here is one novel thing that I think, spending a lot of years working in research at universities or the Federal Reserve System, that didn't really occur to us in a way that it should have, and that is, what about asking people, right? Starting with, what are the challenges that people are having, and how do we go about helping to resolve that? So on the one hand, we have a research world, and people think that we know or understand what the issues are. And then over here, we might have a set of intermediaries where there might be workforce boards or others who are invested in helping to resolve those problems. And then there's this third component, and that is the individual worker. What are the challenges that the workers are experiencing themselves? And unfortunately, those three circles haven't coalesced in ways that can produce the types of results that individual workers get an opportunity to see. At WorkRise, we've really been thinking very intentionally about how do we hear from those voices, and working more with intermediaries. I do want to give a shout out to the Federal Reserve, Ashley Putnam and Sarah Miller, who've been leading work on worker voices and actually conducting a rigorous survey and understanding of what is it that workers want, how are they experiencing their positions. And at WorkRise, we use information like that and from organizations that are very much on the ground who are talking to workers to help to craft our research agenda, so that we're ensuring that, A, we're resolving a problem that people really need to see resolved. Now, the next important piece is who conducts the research. So it's great that we have people who are, I and others in this room are products of many of these very hallowed institutions, so no disrespect. But there are opportunities. I was sharing with them, I think I was sharing this with Whitney yesterday, is that it's great that we work with the University of Chicago, but what about Chicago State, right? So these are people who are closer and who have things to say, and maybe they're not publishing in the top academic journals in their field, but yet they are closest to the problem, or they're closest to the solution too. So how do we bring and look for people in those networks? And by the way, often those people are more likely to be people of color, and they're more likely to be people who have actually experienced the condition for which we are seeking to resolve. Another component of that is a lot of the work that, and you know this quite well, a lot of the work that we do where that gets informed is done by economists. That's amazing. What an amazing field. But you know from your work every day that a lot of what we do is related to a lot of other fields, whether it's social work, right? Or whether it might be people who are working in some sort of political economy. So we've got to think differently about the types of skills and metrics that are coming to bear to inform the types of solutions that we have. And then finally, and by the way, I'm hoping that you can go back to share this with your networks and your communities. I know I live in Atlanta and we have a data council there that's working on workforce issues, and I think these are the types of things that they are beginning to embrace. But the final point that I want to share is how do we package that information? So I work with a mayor in Atlanta, previous mayor, and this individual would always ask me, well, Todd, I'm thinking about reforming or thinking about making changes to our workforce development system. How should I think about it? And I said, oh, okay, I got something for you. Mayor, I'm sending you this great paper that speaks to that. And it's like, okay. I see the mayor 2 weeks later. Hey, I'm still kind of just, well, did you read the paper? You know, that's kind of some things that were in there. Then, you know, it's like, okay, I'm gonna take a look at that. And then a month later, it's kind of like, you know, running to her church. Oh, I'm still kind of struggling on that. Well, my aha moment was, I love to read a paper, but not everybody's into that, right? It's not everybody's thing. So I think what that is instructive for us is that we've got to find new ways of communicating and sharing really important information. And for a mayor, that might look like, I need 3 bullets. I don't need to know the theory. I really want to understand what are the 3 things I need to do. And so we've been working really hard at WorkRise about how do we take this very complicated set of information that is emanating from the academy, and how do we translate that in a way that could reach a worker advocate organization, that can reach an employer who is actually interested in doing the right thing, or reaching a worker who might be empowered by having this information so that they can advocate for themselves. That's not always easy or simple to do, but it's something that needs to be done. So I'll conclude by saying that a lot of the questions that we have in the field are things that evidence kind of already, there is a body of evidence that can respond to that, but unfortunately it's been buried and hidden in these places, so we need to work harder about how to bring that out.
So Robert, your organization does a lot of work around federal policy and state policy, and I listed a bunch of federal policy that has come down in the last couple of years. This is a really big investment time for our federal government in the work that we do, which is very exciting. What's still missing?
A lot. I actually have several colleagues in the audience who will be presenting later today who can speak in more detail if people have a chance to meet with them. I mean, what I'll say is, you know, right now it's a critical period, right? Between now and November, there's a certain stall, I would say, and then it depends on the results of the election. What we have seen, though, at the National Skills Coalition, and we talked about this at our own event in May, is that there is a growing interest among federal leaders, as evidenced by a number of bills that have been introduced, but also conversations we have with various departments and agencies for the kinds of policies that would equip workers with those skills, with those supports, and with those resources to succeed in a wide range of jobs, right? So we have seen, for example, a growing interest in making sure that all of the federal investments in infrastructure also, and infrastructure jobs, essentially, will reach women and Black, Latinx, and other people of color who historically have been underrepresented in that sector. And if those jobs are higher paying, and many of them are, than the average job, then that's an opportunity to create career mobility for populations that have historically struggled with that, right? The second is that there is a need for digital skills still. A lot of money is flowing from the federal level to the state level, and so, you know, we want to make sure that states are capitalizing on that funding and creating the kinds of programs and supports that ensure workers across the spectrum have the digital skills that are needed right now in these jobs, right? And technology, AI, digital skills, et cetera, moves at a rapid pace. What you know today is different than when you know 12 months. So it's a mix of both, upskilling, reskilling, preparing people for new jobs, et cetera, right? And I also think that there is an interest, per my previous question, in the care economy. So earlier this year, one of my colleagues attended a child care summit that was hosted by the US Chamber of Commerce, and it was the first of its kind from the Chamber of Commerce. And it was their way of saying that the needs of businesses and the economy, the way in which our federal leaders invest in those sectors and in those areas, is intrinsically tied to the ways in which parents, people, mostly women, need childcare support. And unless we invest as employers and as public leaders, workers won't be able to thrive economically. And we're far behind from what other countries around the world have done in regards to childcare and in regards to long-term care, right? And so I think there's growing interest. I think, again, it depends on the November election for all of that. And I have always found that the most profound voices in those conversations from the field have come from our network. So they have come from workers and students and local business owners, people who come from different states and cities. I'm in New Jersey and grew up in Colorado, in case there's anybody in the audience. I hear silence, so no. Just totally fine, totally fine. I'm happy to represent both. And so, but those leaders that can share their localized experience and their ideas for what policy makers should do, I think is a critical next step around our federal work. Yeah.
As we've mentioned, it is a very hard time to be working on racial equity. We had a moment where everybody was working on racial equity, and then we saw some folks fade away. And it can be really heavy and hard and exhausting. And Anne, I noticed when you described your organization, you used the word joy. Can you talk a little bit about how we bring joy into this work?
Yeah, I think joy is an intention. And I think it's not something that we talk about in the work much, and we wanted to really be intentional about that. I think part of it is that people are more than their struggle. They're more than just looking at deficits. And you go into a community and people, they know those stats. They know that people are struggling. But if you could actually think about how do you lean into joy, and so for us it's both an intention in our organization, but also in our qualitative research, right? We really want to do things very differently, because a lot of what we do when we ask people about their lives is very extractive. We're really asking people to talk about their struggles, to talk about terrible work conditions and all of these things. And we started to say, is this really going to give us robust information and real lived experience? And so what we're doing is, we call it joy-centered methodology. And it's an experiment. But how can we bring more healing and joy when we actually work with people? And part of it too is making that less extractive, but also really helping people do some visioning and dreaming a little bit, and then getting into a conversation with them. And what we've learned so far is it changes the game. It really has, what we hear from people is much more expansive. What they can actually contribute to is a lot more than just us pulling from them. And so that's why we think it's just so critical to think about joy as a way for people to dream about their lives, and so that's what we're bringing.
So I'm going to ask the same question. Yeah, see, people like joy. I'm going to ask a question for all of you, so you guys can argue over who's the first to answer. But what is holding us back? We've talked about some of the things we want and some of the things we desire. What's preventing us from getting there?
I'll start. I think, I would zero in on the narrative that the dominant narrative that our culture has on workers, on equity, and the economy. I sit on the board of the Frameworks Institute, which studies dominant frames and cultural mindsets on a range of issues, including labor. And one of the things that their research has found, and I think a lot of us can attest to this, is that there are dominant narratives that really see certain workers as valuable and many others as not valuable, right? Direct care was an example, right? The greatest misconception we heard about direct care was that it was low-skilled or unskilled work, which was a gross misunderstanding of that job. It actually requires hundreds of hours, at least 100 and some hours of training. It requires physical and emotional skills, et cetera. And we see this with a lot of labor, and especially the labor that is often kind of exacted by people of color and immigrants and women, right? And that's a dominant narrative that I think punishes us through policy and in stories and in so much more. There's also a dominant narrative that is, I think, increasingly, and a concerted effort to render illegal DEIA initiatives in education and in employment at the state level and writ large nationally. And Amanda and the National Fund team coordinated an amazing tour to the National Civil Rights Museum yesterday. And I remember as I was walking through the rooms and the walls of history, generations and eventually decades of major civil rights movements, someone remarked that it really felt like you were seeing both the struggle, the pain, and the hardship in one way, and another level, the persistence and the imagination of activists who created a new world that still needs quite a bit of repair, right? And I think that the narrative, the attack on DEIs, in my perspective, is an attack on museums like that, right? They're an attack on the ways in which we've historically preserved the stories that explain why so many of us actually do not succeed regardless of our merit. And it also is an attempt to ignore the kinds of resistance and resilience and activism that so many working people bring to this conversation. And so I think a new narrative on workers, labor, and where equality and opportunity fit in that would be, I think, substantial for this country.
And maybe if I can build off of that, because that was so powerful. I think speaking to this room in particular, people who are committed in improving workers' lives, I want to go back to elementary school a little bit.
That's a long time ago.
Yeah, that was a bit ago. But who remembers those Venn diagrams? So, right, okay, well, I'm dating myself. I guess maybe they don't teach that anymore. Okay. But anyway, they were these concentric, there were circles, so there was a, right? And then sometimes they would converge. But in our world, and what I'm getting at is that I think what's missing is that we have various systems. We have a workforce system, we have a community development system, we have a economic development system, we have housing, and each of us are busily doing what we do and undertaking the work that we do, and we're making incremental progress. I think what's missing is that we still have an opportunity to converge and coalesce for that Venn diagram, for those circles to come together so that we can participate and we can have stronger outcomes, because ultimately it's about the person, it's about the worker, it's about the family, and we've got to figure out ways for those processes to work together. I'm going to share a quick story with you about Atlanta. That's the city where I live. And so we have an amazing workforce team, and we've had that for many years. Every city has challenges, but they do amazing work. The same with economic development. Who's been to Atlanta? Okay, almost the entire room has been to it. If you've never been to Atlanta, you've been through Atlanta, transferring, connecting through our airport. But Atlanta is a city that has experienced an amazing economic boom over the last 25 years or so. We've had amazing growth in terms of attracting and recruiting Fortune 500 companies to our city, et cetera. But what's really kind of hidden and kind of an ugly truth about the city that I call home is that When you look at the outcomes of the people, and I'm going to use the word indigenous to be provocative, intentionally so, but when you look at those workers, the outcomes have actually atrophied or either they've regressed. So we've seen downward movement in that. So how could these two things be true? We've had this amazing growth and we hear about this is a mecca for black wealth and prosperity, but yet on the other hand, we find that the outcomes, the workers themselves are not experiencing that. And so I think that's an opportunity for our systems to come together to really begin to ask hard questions of one another, but really to coalesce around some of them. I'll end by saying or suggesting that we've been doing some work with New Growth Innovation Network, the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, in thinking about the role of economic development. Economic development really kind of helped to cause this problem, right? They recruited these companies without care, without asking questions about, are these quality jobs? We're giving you tax incentives, but yet we don't really ask the types of questions that we should ask. So I invite you, or I would encourage you to have more conversations, not just among yourselves, but to really think about penetrating these other systems where we can think about having common metrics. So is it appropriate, is it enough for an economic development agency in your community to have to be evaluated by the number of jobs created or the amount of capital investment brought into the community? Is that really enough? Shouldn't they be thinking about the quality of the jobs or how it's moving particular populations forward, et cetera? So there are opportunities for us to work together, and I think that part is, I don't want to say it's missing, but we need to think more intentionally about how we're coalescing our systems.
Well, I don't know how to follow a Venn diagram. That's no, I totally agree with everything that's been said. So I'll say something a little bit different but connected. I think we haven't made progress because it starts with us. You know, I really think that, you know, in order to, when you think about your professional career, how you transform as a professional in this work really takes a lot of being challenged and being uncomfortable. And I think that we can't get to those narratives if as individuals in this work, we don't challenge ourselves about the narratives that we hold, because we hold those narratives. We do it all the time. We might not even be conscious of it. You know, when I started this work, I'm a policy analyst by training. I didn't know anything about narrative change. I didn't know what that was. I thought it was just words that you say that sound good. I didn't understand people's mental models and how that works. And so I had to move into another sphere that really I was not trained in, I was not comfortable in. I started to push for this like almost 15 years ago. People said, you are crazy. I don't know what you're saying. We don't care. And I had to keep pushing, right? And now, you know, clearly this is a real thing. And so I say that until we start examining our own narratives, how they're held individually, how we hold them in our organizations, if we don't start examining that, we can't think about narrative change over here. We are the ones that are going to carry that forward, right? We need more sparks. We need catalytic change, and that's going to come from people who say, I know how I can connect with this system over here. I am forming this group over here. It's hard to break down systems and break through them. We know the challenges, but that's how we've made progress, where it's been a few people and that grows, and then we start to see real change. And so I just challenge us to say, look, you know, in terms of the racial equity space, of course, we're in a backlash. We knew we were going to be in a backlash. We knew a year after George Floyd that there was going to be a backlash. So this is a matter of taking steps forward and taking a step back, but we will persevere. And we need new solutions. We need to be super creative, sometimes a little stealth, but we need to use our imagination to get to this next place. So I say it really starts with us.
So speaking of this next space, you mentioned the word sparks. What is exciting you right now? What's the thing that excites you most in this moment in our field? And this is a curveball question, so they weren't necessarily expecting this.
I won't say that I'm excited about a lot of things right now, and WorkRise is nonpartisan, so I'm not going to say everything that I'm excited about most. But I will say that there's a lot of excitement around, and fear, I should say, so I want to balance that around the role of technology, AI, and what that means for our future and what the future of work looks like. And I think it's one thing to be fearful about it, but I also am excited about the opportunities of what that could mean for empowering workers to have more autonomy about the way in which they work, and to allow them to more quickly and easily access skills that will allow them to move up, to experience more higher levels of economic mobility. I don't want to get wonky into all of the details of that, but I do want to say that there's a bit of nervousness that I feel about that, but I'm wholly excited.
I'll say that for the first time in my career, I'm in a space, because I've created this thing, where I feel free, where I feel like I can step into my own liberation, at least for now. I don't know what it'll be 5 years from now, but this is how I feel right now. And why is that really important? I'm excited that there's still some funders who are opening up spaces for innovation and experimentation in the face of uncertainty. And for me, I think about, we think a lot about dreaming and visioning. And people might say, that's fluffy work. And then they say you're from California, and that probably fits with you anyway. But no, what I mean by that is, given the complexity of the issues that we're dealing with, where do we have spaces to vision and dream? Where do we have, I'm talking about not coming to a 2-hour thing where you're up and you're doing, stickies and putting them on the board. I'm talking about real visioning and dreaming spaces that will get us to that next space. And so I'm excited about the opportunity to do that more, and the opportunity to do that with more people. That's where I am right now.
I think I'm excited by the stories that I see in the news or even on the job, et cetera, of individuals who takes what are seemingly small steps that have major systemic repercussions, right? I'm thinking about a person who stops their state from becoming a certain type of state and they hold steady to their principles, right? I'm thinking about the workers who organize in their specific work environment, they create a union and they completely transform the relationship between management and labor, right? And I'm inspired by the stories that we see at National Skills Coalition and that we help create of people working across the aisle, right? We often talk about the increased polarization in this country, and that's a real thing in research and reality, right? Especially at the federal level. And yet what we often miss is for people working in states, there are many examples in which that binary is actually much more nuanced, right? And it depends on the issues and the people and the strategy, et cetera. And that when you find and identify that common solution, which can be something like training or credentials or something else, right? That you're able to actually come together, set aside those differences, and move it forward. And there are still real life examples of that. And I think for our democracy to thrive, we need to continue that bipartisanship.
So I'm going to go totally rogue and ask one last thing, which is you have a room of over 400 people out here. What's something you want to tell them?
Be bold. Be fearless. That's what I would say. It will take us further. Lean into your own knowings. That's what I would say.
I'll just say that the work that we do requires a high level of authenticity, passion. And it's not always easy to bring that every day, but I'll share one song that I use that inspires me, and I'll just encourage that. And it's great that we're here in the South because it's by Mahalia Jackson. And she says, "I want to live the life I sing about in my song. right? So I just would leave you with those words, because we want to live, we want to do and be authentic about the work that we do and lead those lives as individuals, because that's really going to impact the quality of our work, the impact of our work.
I love that. I'll bring it full circle and I'll quote one of my favorite singer-songwriters, Mariah Carey.
I love it.
And I'll just say, make it happen. Right? Take everything that we learned and make it happen.
So we started with a singer, we end with a singer. Please join me in thanking our panel.